The inspection notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into Mark Chen's mailbox with the kind of passive-aggressive precision that only a person with too much time and a laminating machine could achieve. It was laminated. Laminated. The notice itself was wrapped in clear plastic like it was meant to survive a nuclear winter, with little yellow sticky tabs pointing to specific violations, each one flagged with the same aggressive highlighter yellow that made Mark's eye twitch. He stood in his driveway at 7:47 a.m., coffee growing cold in his hand, reading through the inventory of his alleged crimes. Excessive lawn clippings in front bin, violation code 231. Recycling bin stored visible from street on non-collection day, violation code 147. Grass height exceeds 3.5 inches in southwest corner of lot, violation code 312. Suspicion of unauthorized waste disposal on adjacent property, violation code 589. That last one made him read it 3 times. Suspicion of unauthorized waste disposal on adjacent property, that was Janet Morrison's house. He knew it before checking the signature at the bottom. He'd known it would be her name there, written in that aggressive calligraphy she'd started using ever since she became HOA president 8 months ago. Janet Morrison, President, Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. She'd even added a little flourish under her name, a swooping underline that somehow managed to be both elegant and threatening. Mark was 47 years old. He worked in cybersecurity. He paid his mortgage on time, had never received a single violation in the 12 years he'd lived here, and had a modest, well-maintained suburban home that looked like 90% of the other houses on Maple Drive. He didn't understand what he'd done to deserve Janet Morrison's particular brand of vigilance. He'd first noticed her about 4 months after she took office. She'd appeared at his back fence one Saturday morning while he was trimming hedges, just standing there, hands on her hips, watching him work with the intensity of someone studying an art theft in progress. She was a thin woman, probably in her early 60s, with blonde hair that always looked blow-dried within an inch of its life, and the kind of permanent expression on her face that suggested she'd forgotten how to move the muscles needed for smiling. "Hi," Mark had called out, somewhat confused by her presence. "Can I help you?" "Your hedge is dropping leaves on my side," she'd said, not bothering with pleasantries. "That's a violation of Section 4.2 of the HOA Charter." "I'm trimming it now," Mark had said, forcing a smile. "It'll grow back." "It won't grow back," Janet had corrected him, as if he were a moron who didn't understand basic biology. "It will continue to shed. What you need to do is trim it to a 45-degree angle so all debris falls on your property." She'd walked away before he could respond. That had been 4 months ago. Since then, there had been 7 more notices. 7. The recycling bin had been mentioned 3 times, the grass height twice. There was one memorable notice about the angle of his mailbox post, which apparently deviated 1 degree from the HOA architectural standards, which Mark hadn't even known existed until he'd had to pay $50 to have a surveyor come out and confirm that, yes, technically, his mailbox post was wrong. The HOA president before Janet, a reasonable man named David Humphreys, had never sent a single notice in 5 years. He'd been content to manage the common areas and send out a monthly email about neighborhood happenings. Nobody had complained. Nobody had been upset. And then Janet had run for office, promising to restore neighborhood standards and take pride back to Pine Ridge. And she'd won with 63% of the vote because apparently a lot of people on Maple Drive and the adjacent streets felt like their suburban existence had become morally compromised by the occasional visible recycling bin. Now Mark stood in his driveway, staring at the inspection notice, and felt something shift in his chest. A tightness, a cold, creeping sense of injustice that seemed to seep into his lungs. He drove to work in a bad mood, took it out on a vendor call around 10 a.m., and then spent the rest of the day composing increasingly angry emails in his head that he knew he would never send. By 5 p.m., he decided to handle it the proper way. He would schedule a meeting with Janet, explain the situation calmly, and maybe help her understand that there were more important things in life than mailbox angles. Janet Morrison lived at 427 Maple Drive, directly across the street and 3 houses down. He could see her house from his property. It was, he had to grudgingly admit, very well maintained. The lawn was pristine. The flower beds were immaculate. The fence was painted a charming shade of cream that probably violated some city code about fence colors, but apparently those only applied to other people. She answered the door in yoga pants and a Lululemon jacket, her blonde hair still blow-dried to perfection, not a single strand out of place, despite the fact that it was 5:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and most people had usually given up on looking presentable by this point in their day. "Janet," Mark said, forcing his face into a neutral expression, "do you have a minute to talk?" She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. "About," she asked finally. "The inspection notice. I think there might be some misunderstanding about the recycling bin and the grass height. I wanted to explain." "The notice is self-explanatory," Janet interrupted, her voice taking on the particular quality it always got when she was in HOA mode, something between a kindergarten teacher and a prison warden. "Section 147 is very clear. Non-collection day storage is visible from the street. That's a violation." "It's in my garage," Mark said. "You can't see it from the street." "Your garage door was open," Janet said. "I could see the edge of the bin." "The garage door was open for 4 minutes while I was taking the trash out." "That's enough time," Janet said. She stood in her doorway, not inviting him in, not moving to come out. She was using the doorframe the way a border guard might use a booth, as a physical barrier between her territory and his. "The bin needs to be stored completely out of view, or you dispose of it in a different manner." "What different manner? It's recycling. It has to go somewhere." "Not my problem," Janet said. "That's in your deed restrictions. Read them." She started to close the door. "Wait," Mark said. He could feel his voice starting to shake. "The notice also mentions waste disposal on your property. I haven't disposed of any waste on your property. I'm not sure where that accusation is coming from." Janet's eyes narrowed. "I found evidence," she said quietly. "Trash that appeared to have come from your house." "What evidence?" "Discarded items in the wooded area between our properties, with what appeared to be your household items." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Mark said. "And honestly, even if I did dispose of trash in a wooded area, which I didn't, it would need to be on our mutual property line, which technically might be considered neutral ground, not your property." He hated how he sounded defensive. He hated how she was making him defend himself for something he hadn't done. "The property line runs 6 feet to the east of where I found the items," Janet said. "That puts it entirely on my side." "I don't know what you found," Mark said, "but it wasn't from me." Janet smiled then. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that made Mark think of sharks. "Well," she said, "we'll see what the official inspection reveals. The town inspector will determine the violation, and if it's confirmed, you'll have 30 days to remedy or face fines. Escalating fines, if I recall the ordinance correctly." She started to close the door again. "Good day, Mark." He went home and drank an entire bottle of wine while sitting in the dark. By 10 p.m., he'd moved on to anger that felt almost productive. He decided he would document everything. He would photograph his own trash setup. He would measure his grass. He would prove that he was in violation of nothing, and then he would present this evidence to the town, and Janet Morrison would be revealed as either a liar or so obsessed with enforcement that she'd simply made things up. He didn't know yet that this decision, this perfectly reasonable, normal decision to document his own property, would be the thing that started everything unraveling. Part 2, The Evidence Hunt. Mark began his documentation the following Saturday morning. He'd purchased a measuring tape, a high-end camera, and a small notebook, and he'd approached the task with the kind of methodical intensity that usually served him well in his career, but which, he would later realize, made him look approximately 1/8 as unhinged as Janet Morrison appeared to the rest of the neighborhood. He measured the grass with the tape measure extended, getting his camera from multiple angles to prove the height. He documented the recycling bin situation with a series of photographs showing that it was not, in fact, visible from the street unless one walked onto his property and physically craned one's neck around his garage. He created a document with all the measurements, a summary of each violation, and photographic evidence proving his innocence. It took 4 hours. When he was finished, he felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He'd also printed out the HOA charter and the specific code sections that Janet had cited. He'd highlighted the exact wording of each violation to show that he was in compliance. He'd created a presentation quality document with tabs and a cover page. It was, he had to admit, the kind of response a man who was beginning to lose his perspective might create. On Monday, he emailed Janet a copy of his documentation. She did not respond for 3 days. On Thursday, she sent an email, copied to the HOA board, that stated, "I have received Mr. Chen's defensive document. The measurements appear to be self-reported and therefore not reliable. A professional inspection will be scheduled for Saturday at 9 a.m. If Mr. Chen wishes to dispute the findings, he may file an appeal with the board." That was when Mark realized something crucial. Janet didn't care about the rules. She cared about winning. The rules were just the weaponry. She had decided, for reasons unknown, that Mark Chen was the enemy, and no amount of documentation was going to change her mind. He went to the inspection with his copies of his own measurements. The town inspector, a tired man named Rodriguez who looked like he had 100 other inspections scheduled and absolutely no interest in the beef between Mark and Janet, took approximately 15 minutes to walk around Mark's property. "Grass is within code," Rodriguez said. "Thank you," Mark said. "I have the measurements documented." "Recycling bin situation is a gray area," Rodriguez continued. "Technically, the edge is visible if you walk to a specific spot on the street. Technically, but practically, it's not a violation I'd normally cite. That's more of a judgment call from the HOA." "So I'm in violation?" Mark asked. "I'd say it's borderline," Rodriguez said. He was standing in Mark's backyard now, looking at the wooded area between Mark's property and Janet's. "This other thing she mentioned, the waste disposal, where is she saying she found it?" "In the wooded area," Mark said. "But I don't know what she's talking about. I haven't disposed of anything there." Rodriguez walked toward the tree line. Mark followed, watching as the inspector pushed aside some brush and peered into the shadowy area between the two properties. The woods were overgrown here. Neither Mark nor Janet maintained this area particularly well because it didn't face the street. It was just a tangle of trees and undergrowth and the accumulated mess of suburban neighboring. "I'll check it out," Rodriguez said. They walked into the wooded area together. Mark had maybe been out here twice since he'd moved in, once to look at a fence that needed repair, and once because he thought he'd heard a wounded animal, but it had turned out to be a car alarm from the next street over. Now, pushing through the brush, he noticed that there was indeed some kind of debris scattered about. There were plastic bags, some of them split open. There was what looked like old newspaper. There was something that might have been a mattress frame, though it was so deteriorated it was hard to tell. "Huh," Rodriguez said. He crouched down and picked up a piece of junk mail, holding it carefully with 2 fingers like it might bite him. "This is addressed to 429 Maple Drive." Mark's house was 433 Maple Drive. "That's not my trash," Mark said. "I've never put anything here." "The junk mail is from 2019, Rodriguez said. "Whatever's out here has been here a while." They looked at each other. "Look," Rodriguez said, straightening up. "I'm going to mark this area as requiring further investigation. There's clearly been some kind of dumping happening here, but it's not recent. It predates your occupancy from what I can tell. Your property is in violation for the recycling bin storage. Just fix that and you're fine. As for the dumping, that's probably been going on for years, not your problem." "But Janet," Mark started. "We'll get a note that the dumping site predates the current residents and appears to have originated from multiple properties," Rodriguez finished. "That's not something I can cite you for. Isn't her property either, technically. It's a gray area. Could be municipal land, could be her dead husband's old property, could be anything. But it's not currently an active violation on your end." He packed up his equipment and left. Mark stood alone in the wooded area for a long time after Rodriguez drove away. He couldn't explain the trash. He'd never put anything there, he was certain of that. But as he stood in the shadowy brush looking at the junk mail from 429 Maple Drive, he felt a strange pull of curiosity. Not about his own vindication, though that was certainly satisfying, but about the trash itself, about how long it had been here, about why Janet had been so certain it came from him. He got a garbage bag and started picking things up. It took almost 3 hours to clear the area. The trash was old, really old. He found newspapers from 2018, 2017, 2016. He found what looked like old mail from multiple residents. He found broken furniture and soggy cardboard boxes that fell apart when he touched them. He found things so deteriorated they were barely recognizable anymore. At one point, While he was pulling back an enormous piece of rotted wood that looked like it might have once been a bookshelf, his shovel caught on something solid beneath it, something metal. He knelt down and started to pull away the wood and debris. His heart began to beat a little faster. Under the rotted wood and accumulated dirt was a metal box. A large metal box, maybe 2 feet long and 1.5 feet wide, the kind of thing that might have once been a toolbox or storage container. It was heavily corroded, covered in rust and mold and the patina of genuine age. The lock was intact but rusted shut. As Mark carefully extracted it from the surrounding debris, dirt fell away to reveal something that made him catch his breath. Mark sat in his garage for 20 minutes just staring at the metal box. He'd cleaned away most of the dirt and debris. The date on the top was unmistakable. 1887. That was over 130 years ago. This wasn't just old, it was impossibly old for this suburban neighborhood that had been developed in the 1970s and 1980s. He knew he should contact someone, an expert, a historian, someone who understood what he might have found. But instead, he opened his laptop and searched 1887 metal box. He found references to time capsules, vintage storage boxes, Depression-era containers. He found nothing that explained how a 130-year-old metal box would end up buried in his suburban backyard. His rational mind suggested multiple possibilities. Someone had found the box and buried it here years ago. The property had had previous owners. The box could have come from somewhere else entirely. There was no reason to assume it had any particular significance beyond being an old piece of junk that had somehow ended up in the woods between his and Janet's property. But Mark was experiencing something that he'd been avoiding for months, the feeling of curiosity overriding caution, the desire to know something, to understand something that was stronger than his sense of practical responsibility. He tried to open the box gently. The lock was completely rusted and wouldn't budge. The hinges were similarly immobile. He tried several approaches, WD-40, gentle tapping with a hammer, a screwdriver to try to pry the lock open, before settling on the fact that he was going to need to saw it open, even though the thought of damaging whatever was inside made him profoundly uncomfortable. He went to the hardware store and bought an angle grinder. At 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening, Mark fired up his angle grinder in the garage, put on safety goggles, and began to carefully cut around the lock. Sparks flew. The sound was tremendous, echoing through his garage and undoubtedly throughout the entire neighborhood. It was the kind of sound that made neighbors peek out their windows. It was the kind of sound that suggested someone was either fixing something very practical or destroying something very valuable. It took him 45 minutes to create an opening large enough to get a crowbar into. His hands were shaking slightly as he positioned the crowbar and began to pry. The box resisted at first. The metal was thick. The rust had bonded things together, and then with a groan that sounded almost pained, the lid began to give. It lifted, and underneath. Mark stopped, barely breathing. There was oilcloth, protective oilcloth, stained and stiff with age, but clearly deliberately placed to protect whatever was underneath. And underneath that there was a leather journal, and underneath that letters, and underneath that coins, actual coins, and what looked like photographs. Mark carefully extracted the journal first. The leather was cracked and deteriorated, but when he opened it gently, the pages inside were surprisingly intact. The handwriting was faded but legible, written in the careful, flowing script of someone who had learned to write in a different era. The first entry was dated January 3, 1887. Mark began to read. My name is Samuel Whitmore. I am burying this box on my property in what I hope will be a place where it may be found when future times have rendered my current troubles obsolete. I have been told by educated men that the year 1987 will have changed this world beyond recognition. I cannot imagine what I shall not see, but I have faith that whoever finds this box will be wiser about the matters that have driven me to hide it. Mark's hands were shaking now. He read on. The journal was a detailed account of a man's life in the 1880s. It described his family, a wife named Alina, children named Henry and Rose. It described his work as a banker. It described, in careful, coded language that Mark gradually came to understand, a significant financial impropriety that Samuel Whitmore had discovered. Someone in his bank had been embezzling. Samuel had discovered it and faced an impossible choice. Expose the embezzler, who happened to be the bank manager's son, or stay silent. Samuel had stayed silent, but it had tormented him. The journal was filled with anguished entries about his moral cowardice, his fear of consequences, his inability to do what was right because of his own need for stability and safety. And then in an entry dated April 15, 1887, everything changed. I have made my decision. I will bury the evidence of my shame here along with the documentation of the embezzlement in hopes that future generations will be wise enough to know that silence is a form of participation. I cannot face Alina again knowing what I know. I cannot face my God. I have therefore resolved to take the course of action that I should have taken from the beginning. Tomorrow I will go to the authorities. I will expose the theft. I will accept whatever consequences come. God grant me strength, and if any man shall find this box in years to come, let him know that the worst thing we can do is nothing. The journal ended. The next entries were blank pages. Mark looked through the rest of the box. There were letters, dated letters, that appeared to be correspondence with the bank authorities documenting the embezzlement. There were bank records, carefully preserved. There were photographs of Samuel Whitmore and his family, looking stern and formal in the way that people looked in photographs from that era. And there was a newspaper clipping, carefully preserved in wax paper, dated May 20, 1887. Prominent banker arrested in embezzlement scheme, the headline read. Charles Morrison, Vice President of First National Bank, accused of misappropriation of funds. Bank President Samuel Whitmore has cooperated fully with authorities. Mark read the article 3 times. Charles Morrison. He walked back inside his house, sat at his dining table, and called Janet. She answered on the third ring. What? She said, not bothering with a greeting. Janet, Mark said carefully, what's your husband's name? What? She said again. Why are you asking me that? Your last name is Morrison. I'm curious. What's your husband's name? His first name. There was a pause. He's deceased, Janet said coldly. Why? What was his name? His name was Charles, Janet said. Charles Davis Morrison. He was my second husband. He died in 1994. I don't see what this has to do with your violation notices. Mark closed his eyes. Janet, he said slowly, I found something on the property in the woods between our two houses. I think it's something you need to see. I'm not interested in whatever stunt. I'm serious, Mark said. It's something that belonged to your family. I think it's important. He heard her breathing on the other end of the line. I'll be over in 20 minutes, she said finally, and hung up. Mark spent those 20 minutes placing everything from the metal box carefully on his dining table. The journal, the letters, the photographs, the newspaper clipping, the coins. He arranged them in chronological order. He took a deep breath. When Janet arrived, she didn't even knock, just opened his front door like she had the right to. She looked at the display on his table and stopped moving. She looked at the photograph. Samuel Whitmore's face stared back from the past, formal and stern, and somehow familiar in a way that probably only someone with his direct bloodline would recognize. No, she said. The word came out small. Samuel Whitmore was a banker, Mark said quietly. He discovered an embezzlement in his bank. The embezzler was Charles Morrison, your family's. No, Janet said again. Ancestor, Samuel Whitmore exposed the embezzlement. According to this newspaper article, Charles Morrison was arrested, tried, and I would guess convicted. Samuel Whitmore was the one who turned him in. Janet sat down slowly at the table. She picked up the newspaper clipping with shaking hands. My family has a story, she said quietly, about Charles Morrison, that he was falsely accused, that he was ruined by vindictive colleagues, that the shame of it destroyed our family line. My mother told me we were victims of slander and corruption from other bankers who wanted to take over his position. That's not what this says, Mark said, gesturing to the box's contents. Janet looked at the journal. Her eyes were fixed on the handwriting, on the anguished entries of a man wrestling with his conscience. She was crying now, though Mark didn't think she'd noticed. This doesn't prove anything, she said, but her voice had lost all its force. Anyone could have written this. It could be a hoax. It could be. It's dated 1887, Mark said. The box was buried in that condition. The rust, the age of everything. Janet, this is real. I spent my entire life, Janet said, so quietly Mark could barely hear her, believing that my family was wronged, that we were victims. My great-great-grandfather's reputation was destroyed. His children never recovered from the scandal. My family has been trying to restore honor to the Morrison name for 4 generations. Janet, and you're telling me it was all lies, she said, her voice cracked. That we were descended from a thief, that Samuel Whitmore was the hero of this story and Charles Morrison was the criminal. Mark didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that would help. Janet looked at him, and for the first time, Mark saw her not as the HOA Karen who had made his life difficult, but as a woman whose entire sense of identity had just been violently rewritten. I've been treating you terribly, she said. The words seemed to cost her something, based on a lie that I didn't even know was a lie. Mark made coffee. Janet sat at his dining table, staring at the contents of the metal box like they were evidence at a crime scene. They were, in a way, evidence of a crime that had happened 135 years ago, which somehow felt like it was still reverberating through time, still destroying things, still causing ripples of consequences that neither of them could have predicted. Tell me everything, Janet said. She wasn't asking, she was demanding, but in a different way than before. Not hostile, desperate. Mark told her about finding the trash in the woods, about the inspection, about clearing the debris, about discovering the box. She listened without interrupting, her eyes moving over the journal's pages. The newspaper, she said finally, pointing to the clipping. What does it say happened to Charles after the conviction? Mark had skimmed it, but now he read it carefully. Says here he served 5 years, released in 1892. After that there's a notation. Last seen boarding a train to New York, current whereabouts unknown. He ran, Janet said, after he was released. Probably, Mark agreed. Did Samuel Whitmore? Janet stopped. She couldn't seem to say the name without difficulty. Did your Whitmore mention his own family in the journal after he exposed Charles? Mark picked up the journal and flipped through the blank pages to the very end. There was one final entry, written in shaky handwriting that was noticeably different from the earlier entries. The ink was more faded. Mark thought it might be from years later. There's this, he said, and read. I have added this note in the year 1902. I'm an old man now, and a leaner passed to God 3 years ago. I do not expect to live much longer. I wanted to record that my exposure of Charles Morrison's crimes cost me everything. The bank dismissed me 6 months after the trial, claiming that I had damaged the institution's reputation by bringing scandal to their doors. They said a good manager would have handled the situation quietly. I could not find work in any respectable bank after that. We lost our home. My children suffered the consequences of their father's integrity. Henry became ill in 1894 and did not recover. Rose left this city, and I never heard from her again. Eleanor's health declined from grief and worry. And yet I cannot say I regret what I did. Silence would have been worse. Cowardice would have been worse. I have tried to live with the consequences of my choices, and if this life has been harder because of it, so be it. There is a cost to doing what is right. I have paid it. I do not know if this box will ever be found. I do not know if anyone will ever care about Samuel Whitmore's moral crisis. But I know that I did what I could with what I had in the moment I lived through. If you who find this box are tempted to judge me harshly for the suffering my family endured, I ask only that you remember, we always suffer when we choose truth over comfort. The question is whether that suffering means something. The room was very quiet. I don't understand, Janet said. I don't understand how this happened, how one man's choice 135 years ago has led to me sitting at your kitchen table. Consequences, Mark said. Just consequences. Charles Morrison was a criminal. Samuel Whitmore exposed him. Both families were destroyed by it, just in different ways. And now, 135 years later, we're both dealing with what those choices created. I've been cruel to you, Janet said. Her voice was small. I've accused you of things you didn't do. I've made your life difficult for months. And the reason, she stopped, unable to continue. You were trying to protect a family legacy that wasn't real, Mark said quietly. Worse, Janet said. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. I was trying to protect a lie. I was defending the reputation of a man I'd never met based on a story that my family told to avoid facing the truth. And in doing that, I became someone who hurts people, someone who accuses without proof, someone just like Charles Morrison, actually, so focused on protecting myself and my reputation that I didn't care who else I damaged in the process. She stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the sun was setting. The neighborhood looked peaceful and normal. Houses with well-maintained lawns and proper fence colors. People inside those houses, living their lives, unaware of the 135-year-old secret that had just been unearthed between two properties. "What are you going to do?" Janet asked. Mark hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't know," he said. "I suppose I'll contact a historian. This is significant. The journal, the letters, the bank records." "No," Janet interrupted. She turned back from the window. "I mean, what are you going to do about the violation notices, about me?" "I don't know that either," Mark said honestly. "I'm not sure how to feel about any of this right now." "You have grounds to file a complaint against me with the HOA board," Janet said. "Harassment, unfounded accusations. I could lose my position. You could probably sue for emotional distress or something." Mark looked at her. She was right. He could do those things. He had every right. "Do you want me to?" he asked. Janet was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "but I don't deserve for you not to." "What do you deserve?" Mark asked. "I don't know," Janet said. "To understand what my family did, why we became the kind of people who hide from the truth, why it was easier to hate someone we didn't know than to face the fact that we were descended from someone dishonest." "The thing about Samuel Whitmore," Mark said, "is that he also suffered for being honest. He also paid a terrible price. The difference is that he accepted that price as the cost of doing the right thing. He didn't try to make someone else pay it instead." Janet nodded slowly. She sat back down at the table and picked up the journal again. "I want to read all of this," she said. "The whole thing." "You can," Mark said. "Take it, I'll make copies." They spent the next 4 hours going through the entire contents of the box. Janet read the journal in silence, her expression shifting from denial to pain to something that might have been acceptance. She looked at the photographs, studying the faces of her great-great-great-grandmother's enemies and recognizing, perhaps, features that had been passed down through her bloodline. She read the letters from the bank authorities, documenting, in cold official language, the theft that her family had spent 135 years pretending had never happened. At 11 p.m., Mark drove her home. The next morning, Janet sent an email to the entire HOA board, copied to Mark, announcing that she was resigning as HOA president effective immediately, due to personal matters requiring immediate attention. She also rescinded all violation notices previously issued to Mark Chen, pending final determination by the newly elected board secretary. Within a week, the story had gotten out. The newspaper ran a small article, "Historic Time Capsule Unearthed in Local Neighborhood." It quoted Mark talking about the historical significance of the 1887 journal. It mentioned that a local historian had been contacted to verify the contents. It did not mention Janet Morrison or the Morrison family history at all. But in the neighborhood, everyone knew. The HOA Karen who had made everyone's life difficult for 8 months had been exposed as the descendant of a thief. The guy she'd been harassing had found evidence that proved it. Karma had arrived via time capsule. People started speaking to Mark differently. At the grocery store, at the hardware store, at the coffee shop, neighbors who had previously been neutral suddenly became friendly. They wanted to hear the story. They wanted to know about the box. They wanted to see the journal. 2 weeks after Janet's resignation, Mark received a phone call from the bank. Not a bank where he had accounts, but the Historical Preservation Foundation affiliated with First National Bank, the bank where Samuel Whitmore had worked 135 years ago. They wanted to display the materials in a museum. They wanted Mark to appear at a ceremony. They wanted to create a plaque honoring Samuel Whitmore's integrity and courage. Mark agreed, though he didn't particularly want to. It felt like the right thing to do. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the downtown historical district. Mark was asked to speak about his discovery. Local news outlets sent reporters. The historian who had verified the contents gave a presentation on the Morrison-Whitmore case and its historical significance. It was objectively a good thing. A piece of hidden history had been recovered. A man's moral struggle had been honored. The truth had been validated. But standing in front of the gathered crowd, looking at the carefully preserved journal and letters now displayed behind museum glass, Mark felt something that he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated. He delivered his speech, talking about the discovery, the historical significance, the importance of facing truth even when it was uncomfortable. The crowd applauded. People congratulated him afterward. He was briefly a local celebrity. He did not see Janet in the crowd. After the ceremony, he went home. He tried to work on some cybersecurity projects but found he couldn't concentrate. He kept thinking about Janet, about the moment when her entire worldview had shifted. He'd been thinking a lot about that lately. The thing was, Mark had also been living in a kind of comfortable fiction his whole life. He'd believed that right would triumph, that honesty would be rewarded, that following the rules and playing fair would result in fairness. The past months with Janet had challenged that belief, but the discovery of the time capsule had seemed to restore it. He'd done the right thing. He'd maintained his integrity. And in the end, the truth had been revealed and justice had been served. Except Janet wasn't served, she was destroyed. She'd had to face the fact that everything her family had told her was a lie. She'd had to reckon with the knowledge that she'd become, in her own way, a criminal. A woman who had leveraged her power to make accusations she knew she couldn't prove, who had used the system to make someone else's life harder. And when the truth came out, she'd been forced to quit her position, endure neighborhood shame, and live with the knowledge that she'd done this all based on a family legend that wasn't even real. Mark had won, but Janet had lost everything. That bothered him more than he'd anticipated. 3 weeks after the ceremony, he decided to walk over to Janet's house. He hadn't seen her in days. She hadn't come out to get the mail. Her car had been gone for the past week. The once pristine lawn had started to show signs of neglect, grass growing slightly longer than optimal, leaves accumulating in the flower beds. He rang the doorbell, no answer. He knocked, still nothing. He was debating whether to leave when he noticed the garage door was partially open. He could see inside. The garage was empty. No car. The door to the house from the garage was closed, but a light was on inside. "Janet," he called, "are you home?" He heard something, a sound that might have been movement or might have been the house settling. He should have left. This was crossing a line, but something told him not to. He tried the door. It was unlocked. The interior of Janet's house was immediately striking to him because it was the complete opposite of what he'd expected. The exterior was maintained, the structure was intact, but the inside was in chaos. The living room had boxes stacked everywhere. Some were open, revealing clothes, books, kitchen items. Some were sealed and labeled with a thick black marker. It looked like someone was either moving or having some kind of breakdown. "Janet," Mark called again. "I'm in the kitchen," a voice called back. He walked through the house to the kitchen and found Janet sitting at her kitchen table with a bottle of wine and a glass. It was 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. She was still in her pajamas. Her hair, always carefully blow-dried, was pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like a different person than the woman he'd been sparring with for months. She looked destroyed. "Hi," she said. She seemed unsurprised to see him. "I'm packing. I sold the house. It closed tomorrow." Mark wasn't sure what to say to that. "Where are you going?" he asked finally. "I don't know yet," Janet said. She took a sip of wine. "I quit my job too, 30-year career as a financial advisor. I sent in my resignation a week ago." "Janet, what are you doing?" "Escaping," she said. "From this house, from this neighborhood, from the person I've become." She gestured to the empty space around her. "This house was supposed to be my pride and joy. I spent 15 years making it perfect. And you know what? I hated living in it. I hated the pressure to keep it perfect. I hated worrying about what other people thought of how my lawn looked and whether my recycling bin was visible from the street." She poured another glass of wine. "And I think the real reason I cared so much about those rules," she continued, "is because I was trying to build something that felt stable, something that felt controllable, something that felt like the opposite of what my family legacy represented: chaos, shame, crime, ruin. I was trying to make sure that nobody could find anything wrong with me by making sure that everyone else followed the rules perfectly. If the whole neighborhood was perfect, then I could be safe. Then the truth about my family wouldn't matter." "The truth about your family was 135 years old," Mark said. "You didn't do anything." "But I did," Janet said. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I did exactly what Charles Morrison did. I benefited from dishonesty. My family benefited from Charles Morrison's embezzlement. They kept property, maintained a certain status in society, lived relatively comfortably despite the scandal. And then I benefited again by hiding from that reality, by pretending it wasn't true, by creating a false narrative that allowed me to feel superior to people like you. You don't know that Charles's embezzlement benefited your family in any material way." "I don't care," Janet said. "Whether it did or didn't, the point is that I lied to myself, and I made my whole life a lie. and I took it out on you because you represented everything I was trying to deny." Mark sat down at her kitchen table. He didn't take any wine, he just sat there. "I've been thinking," Janet said, "about what Samuel Whitmore wrote, about how there's always a cost to doing the right thing. He lost his job, his family fell apart, his children suffered, and he accepted that as the price. He didn't try to make anyone else pay it." "And you're planning to make yourself pay it?" Mark asked. "By leaving everything?" "I'm planning to stop pretending," Janet said. "To stop trying to be perfect. To stop believing that if I can just control everything and everyone around me, I can avoid facing who I really am." "Who are you, Janet?" Mark asked. She was quiet for a long time. "I'm someone whose family told her a lie," she said finally. "And I believed it so completely that I built an entire identity around defending it. I became someone I don't even like. Someone petty and cruel and obsessed with rules and control. And then the truth came out, and instead of just accepting it and moving on, I'm dismantling my entire life because I can't figure out how to exist anymore without the lie to hold me up." "That's not what you should do," Mark said quietly. "Why not?" Janet asked. "What else is there?" "You could actually apologize," Mark said. "Not just to me, to everyone in the neighborhood. You could acknowledge what you did, but you could also acknowledge why you did it. You could tell the truth instead of disappearing." "That's not how people work," Janet said. "People don't forgive, people just remember." "Some do," Mark said. He was thinking of Samuel Whitmore, who'd paid a terrible price for his honesty but had still written it down, had still buried it, had still decided that doing the right thing was worth the cost. Janet looked at him for a long moment. "You could have sued me," she said. "You could have destroyed me. You had evidence, documentation, an entire time capsule of proof that I was wrong. You could have made me a cautionary tale." "I thought about it," Mark said honestly. "On the day I read that you'd been accusing me of things I hadn't done, I was furious." "What stopped you?" Mark thought about this carefully. "Curiosity," he said finally. "I wanted to know why you were the way you were, and then I found out, and suddenly you were just a person who was terrified and lying to herself, same as everyone else." "So what do you want from me?" Janet asked. "I want you to stay," Mark said. "I want you to face this. I want you to acknowledge what you did. I want you to apologize. And then I want you to actually change, actually become someone different instead of just running away and starting over with a new version of the same lie." Janet started crying, not delicate tears, big, messy, full-body sobs. "I don't know if I can do that," she said. "Then you can try," Mark said. "And you can fail. And you can try again. That's what integrity looks like, Janet. It's not being perfect. It's trying to be better and accepting that the trying is its own kind of failure sometimes." Janet didn't sell the house. She canceled the sale, which cost her money in terms of breaking the contract, but she did it. She sent a letter to the entire neighborhood, copied to all the HOA board members, apologizing for her behavior as HOA president. It was a good letter, thoughtful, specific about what she'd done wrong, not defensive or excusing. It didn't mention the time capsule discovery or the Morrison family history. It just acknowledged that she'd been wrong and that she was stepping down. Some people forgave her. Some didn't. One family moved, claiming that they didn't feel safe in a neighborhood where the HOA president could falsely accuse people of crimes. The neighborhood gossip mill ran for about 3 months, and then gradually people moved on to other scandals and other controversies. Janet took a lower-stress job with a financial firm in the next town over. She worked from home 3 days a week. She stopped obsessing about her lawn, though she still maintained it, just not to the point of perfection. She started attending neighborhood events again, and people were civil if not exactly warm. Mark and she became, in a strange way, friends. Not close friends, not people who chose to spend time together, but they developed a mutual respect born from having weathered a strange crisis together. The time capsule materials went to the Historical Society. The journal was studied by historians interested in 19th century banking and moral philosophy. Samuel Whitmore's story became a small footnote in local history, an interesting human interest angle that appeared in articles about banking ethics and the cost of integrity. Charles Morrison remained a historical villain, his embezzlement documented and verified, his story less interesting than Samuel Whitmore's because it had no redemptive arc, no moral struggle. He had simply been a man who stole and then disappeared. His legacy was that he'd been a thief. The Morrison family would eventually have to come to terms with that. Janet did. She connected with other Morrison descendants and shared what she'd found. Some of them were angry, some of them were defensive, but some of them, like Janet, decided to accept the truth about their ancestor and move on. 6 months after the discovery, Mark was walking home from work on a Friday evening when he passed Janet's house. She was in the front yard, planting flowers in a garden that, he noticed, was somewhat less formally structured than it had been before. The plants were still arranged with some care, but they looked more like something chosen for beauty than chosen for compliance. "Hi, Mark," she called out when she saw him. "Hi," he said. He stopped at the fence. "How are things?" "Fine," Janet said. She stood up, wiping dirt from her hands. "I've been meaning to talk to you, actually. I wanted to ask you something. Would you be interested in co-chairing a neighborhood beautification committee? Not an HOA thing, just a group of neighbors interested in making the area look nice without making everyone miserable about it." Mark laughed. "Are you asking me to help run an HOA-type program?" "I'm asking you to help me show that we can do community standards without becoming tyrannical," Janet said. "I'm asking you to help me prove that I've actually changed, I guess, but only if you want to. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't." Mark considered this. A year ago, he would have said no. 3 months ago, he might still have said no. But now, looking at Janet, at the woman who had been cruel and unfair and who had also been brave enough to dismantle her own life to become someone better, he found himself saying yes. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, let's try it." In the weeks that followed, they drafted a set of neighborhood guidelines that focused on the spirit of community rather than rigid rules. They emphasized that some variation in landscape and property maintenance was not only acceptable but encouraged. They created a process for addressing serious issues while allowing people to live their lives without constant scrutiny. When the new guidelines went to a neighborhood vote, they passed with 71% approval. The remaining 29% was mostly people who'd enjoyed having a vigilant HOA president and were disappointed at the loss of strict control. But they were outvoted. Life in the neighborhood continued. New people moved in. One of them actually did put trash in the woods, and the community process for addressing it was calm and professional. Another person started a small garden that violated traditional landscaping standards, and instead of being cited, they were encouraged to enter a regional gardening competition. Mark sometimes wondered if any of this would have happened if he hadn't found the time capsule. Probably not. Probably he and Janet would have continued their conflict until either she'd felt vindicated by finding some actual violation, or until he'd moved to escape the constant scrutiny. But because of one buried metal box, one man's moral crisis from 1887, one family's secret kept for 135 years, everything had changed. A year after finding the capsule, Mark was interviewed by a local history podcast about the discovery. He talked about the contents of the box, about Samuel Whitmore's story, about the tension between doing what was right and accepting the consequences. "Do you think finding that box changed anything?" the interviewer asked. Mark thought about Janet, about the transformation from HOA tyrant to someone capable of genuine self-reflection. He thought about the neighborhood, about how the guidelines had shifted to become more compassionate. He thought about the broader lesson, that truth, when it emerges, has the power to reshape things, to challenge people to become better versions of themselves. "Yes," he said, "I think it changed everything for at least 2 people, and maybe that's enough." Later that month, Janet sent him a text. It was a photo of a marker, freshly placed in the small park at the end of Maple Drive. The marker bore Samuel Whitmore's name and dates, and a quote from his journal. "There is a cost to doing what is right. I have paid it. I do not know if anyone will ever care about Samuel Whitmore's moral crisis, but I know that I did what I could with what I had in the moment I lived through." Underneath, in smaller text, was added, "And in doing so, he changed not only his family's fate, but that of generations to come. Truth, when finally unearthed, has the power to transform us all." Janet's message to Mark simply said, "I think Samuel would have liked that addition." Mark smiled and texted back, "Yeah, I think he would have." The marker stood in the park for years after that. Occasionally, someone would stop to read it and wonder about the story of Samuel Whitmore and Charles Morrison. Occasionally, people from the Morrison family would visit and see the name of their thieving ancestor contextualized not as shameful, but as a moment that led to someone else's moral growth. And occasionally, on quiet evenings, Mark would walk through the woods between his house and Janet's, looking at the place where the time capsule had been buried. The hole had long since filled in. Trees had grown. The evidence of his excavation was almost completely gone. But every time he looked at that spot, he thought about Samuel Whitmore deciding to bury his truth instead of destroying it. He thought about the man's faith that someday, someone would find it and understand. He thought about how fragile the connection was between past and present, how easily history could disappear if someone hadn't had the foresight to bury it carefully. And he thought about Janet, who had chosen to face her family's truth instead of running from it, who had accepted the cost of change, who had become someone different. There was a cost to doing what was right. Samuel Whitmore had paid it. Janet Morrison was paying it. And Mark Chen, in his small way, had decided it was worth paying too. That was the real lesson of the time capsule. Not that truth always triumphs, not that the good are always rewarded, but that when people choose integrity over convenience, when they choose to face uncomfortable realities instead of hiding from them, they make it possible for others to do the same. And maybe, just maybe, that transformation ripples across time and changes things in ways they'll never completely understand. The marker remained in the park. The truth remained unearthed. And two people who'd once been enemies remained neighbors, connected by a 130-year-old secret and the choice to let it reshape their lives.